rest of the little sleeper was passing off, changing into an unquiet waking. Not with the fear of yesterday, but with a restlessness of discomfort that was not easily soothed. Words and caresses seemed to have lost their quieting power for the time, though the child's face never failed to answer them. But he presently held out his arms to Mr. Linden with the words, "Walk like last night." And for a while then Faith had nothing to do but to look and listen, to the soft measured steps of the room, to watch the soothing, resting effect of the motion on the sick child. As wrapped in Mr. Linden's arms, he was carried to and fro. She could tell how it wrought from the quieter, unbent muscles, from the words which by degree Johnny began to speak. But after a while, one of those words was, "Sing." Mr. Linden did not stay his walking, but though his tone was almost as low as his footsteps, Faith heard every word. "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong, they are weak, but he is strong. Jesus loves me, he who died, heaven's gates to open wide. He will wash away my sin, let his little child come in. Jesus loves me still, though I'm very weak and ill. From his shining throne on high, come to watch me where I lie. Jesus loves me, he will stay, close beside me all the way. Then his little child will take, up to heaven for his dear sake." I imagine the words to this song are not unfamiliar to you. Perhaps as a child you learned them from your parents, grandparents, or during Sunday school or a junior church service. But what is likely very unfamiliar to you is the origin of this song. And as you listen to the opening of this podcast, you may have wondered, what was I reading? And that's a good question. It is an excerpt from a book called Say and Seal by Susan Warner, sister of Anne Bartlett Warner. Sadly, again, you probably have not heard the name of either Susan or Anne Warner. So you probably have additional questions, which are, who is Anne Warner and why is she important and why are we talking about her today on the God's Peculiar People podcast? Well, Anne Bartlett Warner was born on August 31st, 1827, the daughter of a New York City lawyer and investor, Henry Warner. Formerly wealthy, the financial crisis that began in 1837, as well as lawsuits and poor investments, divested Henry Warner of much of his wealth, which would later have an impact on his daughters, Anne and Susan. So these two women grew up in New York and found a home on Constitution Island in New York in 1838 near West Point. As adults, neither married, and their financial situation was limited. As there were few occupations at the time that would allow women to make an income, the sisters took to writing as a means of providing their much-needed livelihood. Throughout their lives, the sisters would write a combined 106 stories and poems. They would co-author 18 books, and each had a pen name. Anne wrote under the name Amy Lothrop, and Susan under the pseudonym Elizabeth Wetherell. Now, in addition to their writing endeavors, many of which were successful, Susan's novel, The Wide, Wide World, published in 1850, would rival Uncle Tom's Cabin as the most widely circulated story of the time. The sisters held regular Bible studies for the cadets at West Point, and would also write a new hymn each month for the Sunday school class she taught. Many of her hymns were collected and published in 2 volumes, Hymns of the Church Militant and Wayfaring Hymns. So Anne would continue teaching the cadets until her death in 1915. That year's West Point graduates, known as the class the stars fell on, included General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was a pupil of the Warner sisters, specifically Anne. So, again, why mentioning them in connection with Jesus Loves Me? Well, let me explain further. So we have a little background about who these women are. At some point in the future, we may talk about more of their work with West Point, because that is a very interesting story. But through writing and teaching, these women had a great, powerful impact on the world around them. But perhaps the woman's greatest gift to the church was the hymn, Jesus Loves Me. This beloved hymn was written by Anne at the request of her sister Susan, who needed a poem to include in her novel, Say and Seal. These well-known words were penned as words of comfort for a child in the story who was dying, little Johnny Fax. The story has his Sunday school teacher, John Linden, compassionately caring for the child as his condition worsens. Johnny asks his teacher for a song, and the teacher sings a new song, a soothing song, Jesus Loves Me. So this hymn that is so well known, sung by children all around the world at this point, began as simply a poem in a book. and a story that was a novel. And that's how it began. That is its origins. Some songs start out, we heard with Sankey, some songs start out as these great, powerful songs in a big camp meeting or some sort of big evangelistic meeting. But Jesus Loves Me started out as a simple, humble, 4-line poem in a book. So the song itself was not set to music in the book, yet in our minds, as we try to read it, we hear that simple tune that has become so familiar with Jesus Loves Me. But Anne was simply the writer of the words. She was a poet, not a composer of tunes. To continue with this, we have to look at how did Jesus Love Me get its now so recognizable tune. So the tune, as well as the chorus, was composed by William Bradbury. Sadly, this is another name that we are very unfamiliar with today, and there will be an episode on William Bradbury in the future because he should be more well known. Because like many in 1860, William Bradbury read the novel by Susan Warner, Say and Seal, and he was drawn to the simple message of Jesus Loves Me. Now, William was known more for his high church music style. He composed such hymns as Sweet Hour of Prayer, He Leadeth Me, On Christ their solid rock I stand. But Bradbury took a simple, childlike approach to Jesus Loves Me, making an uncomplicated tune to fit the song. Now, Bradbury was so successful that with just the opening notes, millions around the world, through the ages since he's penned the hymn, right up until today, can in a moment know the tune and begin to sing. The words of Jesus Loves Me and its tune were first printed together in a hymn book in 1862, and have been in print ever since, a total of 160 years. It is estimated that Jesus Loves Me has been printed in more than 559 hymnals. So these two people working together, we find first Anne Warner writing just this simple hymn for a novel. Then William Bradbury reading the said novel and saying that's a song that needs to be set to music and taking it upon himself to do that. Now, I don't know, I imagine there's some correspondence possibly between the two. It's like William Bradbury reading and saying, hey, this is a great song or a great poem. I want to turn it into a song. Can I compose it, add music to it? I don't know what happened between the two. What letters were exchanged, which discussion was made. I would love to know what happened, but sadly I don't. That might be a possible future episode if I can find some letters between the two and see what was said, what was the exchange. Did anybody change hands? It could be interesting to find out. But just so simple. This hymn could very easily have been lost in obscurity. Could have just stayed in a book and never have been set to music. But paths crossing at just the right time, we are able to have this hymn today. Now, there have been various versions. People have kind of added some verses, changed some things about Jesus Loves Me. And someone did a version. This is from, I didn't keep the link, unfortunately, but it's from a website I think called Slugs and Bugs. And it says, they added 2 new verses at the bottom. So the first verse is the same, the chorus is the same, and then they add, Jesus loves me when I'm good, when I act just like I should, when I say thank you and please, brush my teeth and wash my knees. Jesus loves me when I'm bad, when I talk back to my dad, when I stomp and whine and pout and poke my bottom lip right out. So see, some people have made it fun. It's such an easy tune that it's very easy to add some different words to, and so that's some additional funny verses to sing if you've got kids and you want to make it interesting. Now, in the common version today, verses 2 and 3 were added by David R. McGuire, I believe his name is, and the verse about illness was removed. And so we have, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong, they are weak, but he is strong. Then we'd have the refrain, and then Jesus loves me, this I know, as he loved so long ago, taking children on his knee, saying, let them come to me. Jesus loves me still today, walking with me on my way, wanting as a friend to give light and love to all who live. Jesus loves me, he who died, heaven's gates to open wide. He will wash away my sin, let his little child come in. Jesus loves me, he will stay close beside me all the way. Thou hast bled and died for me, I will henceforth live for thee. I have to be honest, a couple of those verses I had not heard before. The one with Jesus loves me still today, walking with me on my way, that's a new one for me. Typically, I think there's only like 3, maybe 4 verses in most hymn books, so very, very interesting. Now, I have one other interesting story to include, and I mentioned earlier that Eisenhower had met, most likely, had been a student at Anne Warner's Bible study at her home near West Point, but Eisenhower's not the only U.S. president that the internet likes to connect to Anne Warner and Jesus Loves Me. There is a story widely circulated on the internet about the hymn being sung by, at that time, a future U.S. president following a rescue during World War II. Now, what follows is read from an official military report that I found on the internet again, but from a reputable place. But it says, on August 5th, friendly natives delivered a message scratched on a coconut shell to the coast watcher at Wana Wana, who dispatched a war canoe to the rescue and sent the word to Mindova, where memorial services were being held for the crew of PT-109. On August 7th, with Kennedy hiding under ferns in the bottom of the war canoe, natives paddled to Wana Wana, waving gaily at unsuspecting Japanese planes. That night, Kennedy boarded a rescue PT, piloted it to the camp, and picked up his men. On the way, one devout sailor sat on the deck with his arms around 2 mission natives, all 3 singing Jesus Loves Me. Now, some have stated that this devout sailor was JFK himself, John F. Kennedy. And at the time of this recording, I was not able to find any documentation that stated Kennedy himself saying Jesus Loves Me with the natives, who aided him and his men in escaping. This document was found on the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library website, and you can go find the record as well. But it's not telling us that Kennedy sang. However, there are other documents, other stories out there that claim that this was John F. Kennedy. Regardless, there was someone in proximity to John F. Kennedy who during a rescue from an island, I think it was near Papua New Guinea, if I remember correctly, during World War II, that this hymn, Jesus Loves Me, was sung. And the reason it was sung was that this devout sailor, whoever that person was, the 2 natives singing with him were believed to be have been taught by Adventist missionaries, and so they all knew, this was one song that they all knew, and so they sang Jesus Loves Me together. Now, if you have found documentation somewhere, a record somewhere that clearly states that this was John F. Kennedy singing along with these natives, I would love to see that document. That's why I went looking. I was trying to find it. This report that I read, it just states that a devout sailor, it doesn't say Kennedy specifically, but if you know where that document is, I'd love to see it. Please send me a link through my email, studywiththeant@aol.com, or visit Instagram at God's Peculiar People Podcast and let me know about that, because I would love to actually see that, because I've heard the story. I think it's a really cool story about a future U.S. president at the time singing Jesus Loves Me during a rescue, but I just can't find that official document saying that, but I'd love to see it. Now, if you have an interesting story of a time when Jesus Loves Me was sung, I'd love to hear about it. Were you teaching it to some kids? Did someone sing it in a kind of a funny way? Is there a cute verse that you have created to go along with that? Please also share that with me via Instagram. I'd love to see it. Alright, well, that's all for today. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the God's Peculiar People podcast. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, please let me know either through my email or the Instagram account. I'll have those linked in the description. But thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next time.